From Recorded Future News and PRX, this is Click Here. I'm Dina Temple-Rust, and this is Click Here's Mic Drop. Before I started covering cybersecurity, I spent years reporting on one of the marquee stories of the decade, terrorism. And I eventually became a bit of an expert in this very niche thing, the way young men radicalize. I even wrote a book about it.
Correspondent Dina Temple-Rust has been asking why terrorism runs in families.
Young Moroccans who have traveled to Syria to join ISIS. And Al-Qaeda's... They say their client was being fed a steady diet of far-right content and conspiracy theories. Since then, I've turned my attention away from terrorism and towards cyber. And as Yogi Berra might say it seems like déjà vu all over again.
Many of these cybercriminals are young kids, possibly unable to...
A group of teenagers hacking casinos. It sounds like...
Kids who aren't old enough to drink are pulling off epic hacks, and more often than not, they move from the world of online gaming to online crime. Like the 15-year-old who installed a backdoor in U.S. military servers, or the gang of teenagers who swindled crypto investor Michael Turpin out of $24 million worth of crypto.
A lot of these online gangs are so reminiscent of old school street gangs. It's really uncanny.
From Recorded Future News, I'm Dina Temple-Rust, and this is Click Here's Mic Drop, an extended cut of an interview we think you'd like to hear more of. And today, we're returning to a conversation I had over the summer with Allison Nixon. She's an expert in those cyber criminal gangs that use a very effective hacking technique called SIM swapping.
When you look at people that do engage in the most extreme acts, if you look at their history, you can see this pattern of escalation and escalation and escalation until it gets so extreme that they've done something they can't take back.
Stay with us.
You come to the New Yorker Radio Hour for conversations that go deeper with people you really want to hear from, whether it's Bruce Springsteen or Questlove or Olivia Rodrigo, Liz Cheney, or the godfather of artificial intelligence, Geoffrey Hinton, or some of my extraordinarily well-informed colleagues at the New Yorker. So join us every week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you listen to podcasts.
I'm Dina Temple-Rust, and this is Click Here's Mic Drop.
Wait, so what do you think my room looks like?
Let's see, pretty bedspread. Allison Nixon has this specialty. She's steeped in the world of young offenders. She studies them for Unit 221B, the cybersecurity company she works for. And when we met up over Zoom, I think I was half expecting to see some crazy evidence board on her wall.
And pieces of string, putting them together like a beautiful mind.
And X's over their faces for the ones that are already done.
Yeah, exactly, when you take them down.
Allison doesn't actually map out her investigations that way. Instead, she watches them play out online. And she's particularly focused on hackers in their teens and early 20s.
Would it be right to say you sort of, specialize in young cybercriminals?
I mean, I guess you could put it that way.
Part of Allison's interest lies in the fact that young hackers are creative. Often they're behind some of the most innovative attacks.
When I look at what these guys are doing, objectively, it's objectively interesting. They're getting into things that shouldn't be possible, and yet they're doing it successfully.
Consider the SIM swapper. We talked about them in our episode on Tuesday, and their con is simple. They basically sweet-talk some employee at a telephone company to switch the contents of someone's phone to a SIM card they control. And that gives them entree into an untold number of other things. Allison has been tracking teenage cybercriminals like this for years.
And would it be right to say you sort of specialize in young cybercriminals?
I mean, I guess you could put it that way. I kind of fell into it, really.
So talk to me about how that happened.
Yeah, so I've always had this fascination with different kinds of threat actor groups that use novel attacks and have interesting ways of getting into things. And over the years, I've realized that there's this corner of the internet where a disproportionate amount of interesting things happens. They're breaking trust models. They're getting into things that shouldn't be possible, and yet they're doing it successfully.
For the rest of the industry at large, though, something like SIM swapping seemed kind of niche. It didn't get much attention until about 2018, when...
the price of cryptocurrency went way up.
And that made what, just SIM swapping and trying to steal crypto through SIM swapping much more attractive?
Yeah, basically, the rise in the price of Bitcoin made all of these methods profitable. Whereas previously, SimSwap has always been possible. And I had seen it in years past used for essentially frivolous purposes in order to do targeted harassment or stuff like that. But at some point in 2017 and 2018, these guys realized that they could use the exact same techniques to make millions of dollars. So they did. And that has sparked essentially a revolution in this corner of the internet where they've realized, hey, we don't have to waste these techniques on harassing kids in video games. We can use it to become rich. So I'm kind of in that weird position now where I'm like, I told you so.
That's a good position, isn't it?
I mean, I guess, but it would have been nice if they listened before.
Kids can fall into cybercrime for a lot of the same reasons they fall into other misguided pursuits. Though, in a way, cyber is even more alluring because it's virtual. You can't see the victims, so your conscience doesn't nag at you as much. And for kids who are already spending most of their time online, breaking into gaming accounts and stealing usernames or crypto doesn't feel exactly real. It seems more prank than felony. All your friends are doing it, and who is really getting hurt?
Teenagers engage in boundary pushing. That is normal developmental process. And normally the environment starts to push back at a certain point. And kids learn that, hey, you shouldn't do this. There's going to be consequences. And this feedback loop of learning is how teenagers become adults.
The trouble, Allison says, is online, there isn't much of a feedback loop.
The problem is with the internet is the environment will not push back. And so when you do something, there's no consequences. And then you do it more extreme and there's no consequences. Not even really tiny consequences. So as a result, they don't receive that very important learning that teenagers normally in human history have gotten.
And in a world without consequences, well, it's hard for young people to put on the brakes.
You have this teenage street gang culture where certain kinds of behaviors are normalized, which is very different from how the average person would deal with something. Like, for example, there's a lot of this beefing and harassment and like feuding back and forth. And when people spend their teenage years, their formative years, steeped in this reality, they think this is how the world works.
This reminds me so much of just kids and radicalizing, just sort of generally, that you've made me think there are a lot of parallels between people who are in the SIM swapping world and actually people who get attracted to groups like ISIS or even white supremacists, right? So it's somebody who doesn't feel like they have a community, so they go and find one. And for radicalized kids who were joining ISIS, before they knew it, they were on ISIS, websites and talking to people and saying, oh, I can handle it, but they couldn't. And this seems like the same thing of what's going on with these SIM swapping. They're all the same, around the same age. They're all kind of, many of them on the fringes of society. I mean, it's the same brew.
Yeah, there's so many parallels. And I mean, a lot of these people, when they fall down this rabbit hole, they also start to disconnect from people in real life. They disconnect from any kind of stabilizing force in their life to, keep them anchored to what's normal, what's like, how do you treat people? And so when they get deeper and deeper into these rabbit holes, they engage in extreme behavior that alienates them from normal society until it gets so extreme that they've done something they can't take back. They either ruin their life or other people's lives.
The trouble isn't just that young people don't know how they fit into general society. Once they radicalize or start committing crimes, they don't have the tools they need to turn their lives around and make it stop. Not unlike being in a gang or a terrorist group, it just isn't that easy for them to step away from this life.
This is something that a lot of people just seem to assume is like flipping a switch. Like, oh, hey, I've decided I'm not going to do cybercrime anymore. That's not the reality. There's a lot of pitfalls along the way.
Are there red flags, like if they start hanging out with the same people again and that sort of thing? Is that sort of an indication that they're on a risky path?
That's one of the complexities that comes with the whole issue of rehabilitation. Because a lot of these online gangs are so reminiscent of old school street gangs. It's really uncanny. Like when you talk to people that used to be gangbangers, like old school pre-internet gangbangers, and they talk about their experience of trying to leave the gang and how difficult it is to leave the gang and how members of the gang will try to pull you back in. In online gangs, we see a lot of parallels to that. We see members of the old gangs reach out to them and try to drag them back in. Sometimes there'll be a friendly outreach. Sometimes it'll be a hostile outreach. They'll get targeted. They'll get harassed. And the problem is that you can't move to another town to get away from them. You can't move anywhere. The internet is everywhere.
This is not that different than radicalization either. If you hang around with the same people who radicalize you to go and join ISIS, you fall into the old patterns.
Yes, and actually that reminds me of some really interesting conversations I had. So some of the people that in the past worked on ISIS recruitment stuff, they are now also looking at these online gangs and figuring out, hey, how can we deprogram these kids who were essentially radicalized by this domestic, grassroots, chaotic crime culture?
The only problem is these lessons are only useful if they're actually applied. Allison says there needs to be more research into what's working or not to help design effective rehabilitation programs.
There needs to be better information collection on, figuring out how to categorize these people, figuring out what kind of behaviors are a risk factor and what are not. And then also following up with these people years on down the road, figure out, hey, do you have a job right now? What kind of job do you have? Have you gotten any other criminal charges? Do you have people in your life that can vouch for you to say that you've cleaned up your life? Do you have relationships that you can maintain in the long term?
But this kind of research and these programs require a lot of time and money.
So this is something that governments need to invest in, is like, I'm okay with not putting them in prison. But when we let them out, we need to put them someplace where victims can be protected, where perpetrators are also protected from fellow gang members and also themselves. There needs to be some kind of positive program that they can get enrolled into that will help them get out of this world and reintegrate with society and live some kind of productive life that doesn't get wrapped up in all this internet cybercrime drama. And that last piece is what we're missing. And that's what we need.
From Recorded Future News, this has been Click Here's Mic Drop. It was written and produced by Sean Powers and me, Dina Temple-Reston, and it was edited by Karen Duffin. We'll be back on Tuesday. Have a great weekend.
Looking for more of the cybersecurity and intelligence coverage you get on Click Here? Then check out our sister publication, The Record, from Recorded Future News. You'll get breaking cyber news from reporters in New York, Washington, London, and Kyiv, among others. And you'll see for yourself why it attracts hundreds of thousands of page views every month. Just go to therecord.media.